everyone, welcome to week 11 of Chemical Dependency. I'm your new instructor, Amber Donovan, and I feel weird talking to a videotape, but I'm doing this for you so that you can kind of hear who I am, and because we're not going to have specific discussion questions on chapters 25 through 27, I just wanted to hit some highlights from the chapter and make sure that you know to read the chapters, because there's going to be an exam on chapters 15 through 27, and a large portion of the exam will come from these different theoretical models of substance abuse disorders. Chapter 25 talks about the medical model. A lot of you have said to me or emailed me, or you wrote in your catch-up quiz that you really want to know why people get involved in chemical dependency. Why do some people become addicts, and why do some people can just drink recreationally with very little consequences? So these three chapters kind of speak to those questions. So I don't want us to overlook them, even though we're not going to have a lot of discussion. I think I am going to create a discussion forum for you to go in and post questions or comments, more just as a place for you to think through some of the questions and some of the things that are written in these three chapters. But next week will primarily be assignment 2. Some of you have already finished that under the old syllabus, wrote a 6-page paper already and turned it in. I'm just asking that you copy and paste that into the new discussion forum that says assignment 2. We'll be reading through what everybody writes. There'll be really interesting papers, and make sure you reply to 2 people. I will create, like I said, a separate forum, though, to discuss these 3 chapters. And don't neglect reading these 3 chapters. Like I said, they will be tested. So chapter 25 is all about the medical model of substance use disorder. And the first quote on page 333 says, "Treat the person with the disease, not the disease in the person." And that was written in 1910. That's really the truth about treatment issues that we're going to get ready to go into. We're going to talk about assessment and intervention and treatment. But really it introduces the history of the medical model. Jelinek, who is the founder of the medical model, and what he based it on. He has 4 different stages that he talks about, and then they talk about in the book, and classifies the different patterns that people kind of get into in their course of their disease. So that's the very first part of the chapter. The next section is about genetic inheritance disorder or theories. And I loved what this says, because there really are 2 misconceptions about genetic inheritance. One is the belief that the genetic evolution stopped with the development of human culture, and the second is the belief that genetic predisposition is the same thing as genetic predestination. In other words, if your parents had a cancer, a certain type of cancer, you are going to get that same type of cancer. That's what they're saying. Your genes determine your destiny. That's a myth. That is not true. Sorry, my cell phone. Anyway, so we want to make sure that we look at the differences between the different genes, and they talk about the different compounds, the different genetic factors, different genetic markers, and they go through kind of the different types of alcoholics that they've found over different research studies. And then they go into the biological differences theory. They talk about how drugs and alcohol oftentimes over-reinforce or over-reward different systems in your brain, and that's why people continue doing drugs and alcohol, because they get an extreme rush or an extreme reaction that they can't get any other way. So that's the biology piece. And then the whole second part of the chapter is a reaction to the disease model of addictions. So oftentimes people, when they think the medical model, they think it's just one thing, but it's actually 3 things. It's that first medical model that Jelinek came up with, it's the genetic inheritance theories, and it's the biological difference theories. So all 3 of those things make up the medical model. Loved the reaction section in the book that starts on page 338, and it really talks about a lot of people don't buy into the medical model because they say, well, what about personal choice? Don't people have a decision about how much they're gonna drink, or how much they're gonna participate in drug use? And so the author gives a really good and interesting look at all 3 aspects of these different medical model theories. So take time to read through that and some of the challenges that he presents. And that's what I think would be interesting to discuss. So I wish we had more time to discuss it. But it's this idea, and I think for people who grew up with alcoholics or with drug abusers, the idea that they're making a choice, they're putting the drug or the alcohol consumption ahead of the people in their lives is true. And it's easy to say somebody is sick and to absolve them of responsibility, but there's an element of choice as well. So that's kind of that reaction piece. And then it goes on in the next chapter to talk about the psychosocial models of substance use. And it talks about the different perspectives and how if something is a disease, we excuse it. We tend to excuse it more in our culture. So oftentimes, and I love what it talks about because it talks about how oftentimes pharmaceutical companies will develop drugs before there is a disease that actually it can be applied for. And so then they create kind of a disease that you need the medicine for. So that's an interesting discussion. It's about disease mongering is what they call it in the textbook. So go ahead and read through that. One of the quotes on page 346 in your text says, "Today, any socially unacceptable behavior is likely to be diagnosed as an addiction. We have shopping addiction, video game addiction, sex addiction, Dungeons and Dragons addiction, running addiction, chocolate addiction, internet addiction, addiction to abusive relationships, and so forth. All of these new addictions are now claimed to be medical illnesses, characterized by self-destructiveness, compulsion, loss of control, and some mysterious, as yet unidentified physiological component." And then it goes on in the following paragraph to say, "We've become a nation of blamers, whiners, and victims, all too happy when we get a chance to pass the buck to somebody else for our troubles. Just because we are uncomfortable, is it a result of a disease?" And so it just talks about, this chapter really talks about all the different theoretical models. On page 347, there's a chart that you should take a look at. And the author really talks about how it's not really the alcohol or the drug that's the problem, it's the way people use the alcohol. It is not the alcohol itself, it's the use or the behavioral response to it. Then it talks about different personality predispositions and the different defense mechanisms. That's a really interesting discussion. And then chapter 27 is probably the one that would gain even more discussion. That's why I will, like I said, create a discussion for him. It's the look at the spiritual component or spiritual model of addiction, and looking at humans as spirit beings and how we changed from this idea purely, a spiritual being to sort of science as king. And so this idea that we have these mind, body, soul, and that soul piece has kind of been lost over the last 100 years due to the popularity of science. So really interesting chapter. I feel like it leaves a little bit out, goes a little bit, dips a little bit in, and then kind of leaves a little bit more that could be discussed. Talks about how, we often forget that people have to have a purpose in their lives, and that purpose doesn't come from how much money you have or where you live, but the purpose comes in, who am I? What am I doing here? What's the purpose of my life? And many of you are in the social work program because you want to help other people, and that's what you feel your purpose for your life is. But that's a spiritual purpose, not a biosocial purpose, not a medical purpose, but really that's a soul connection that you have, that you want to make. So he talks about kind of the pain of life, the isolation of life, and how addicts really have a love relationship with their drug of choice. And this love relationship becomes the priority. And it kind of helps you understand a little bit more about how addiction really does, he calls it the insanity of addiction, without ever mentioning, people talk about their addiction like it was like their best moments of being in love. So that's something that's for people who've never been addicts have a hard time with, because they don't understand how you could love something that's so destructive and so damaging to relationships. So read through these 3 chapters and then come on over to the discussion forum and just post some of your thoughts. And it's not going to be for a grade, so you don't have to do it, but I think it might be a really interesting discussion. So that's all for now. And if you have any questions, send me an email. Thanks. Bye.